human. What was poking me while we slept?" the alien outcast said. Riley Harris gazed at the faint shimmer of dust rising in thin trails from the cracked ground beneath her boots and felt the old familiar prick of isolation pulse in her heart. She stood at the edge of the Barrens, that dreaded and half-forgotten zone that stretched between the settled sectors of humanity and the elusive territories rumored to house alien tribes. Her breath hung in the searing dryness, every exhalation reminding her she hadn't found what she was looking for, a place to belong or at least a reason to keep trying. She felt the clang of her gear at her hip, and her fingers unconsciously began tapping a silent rhythm on her thigh as she mapped out her next move in her head. That tapping was her hidden tell whenever her mind wrestled with a question. Nobody else might have noticed, yet here she was, as alone as she had ever been. For the past few years, her pursuit of belonging had driven her to the farthest corners of charted space, from the remnants of Earth's last ecodomestic enclaves to the frontier outposts on drifting asteroids. Each place had turned out to be a disappointment or a betrayal. She had grown reluctant to trust, though she yearned for companionship. Standing at the threshold of the Barrens, she told herself she would pass through this hellish corridor quickly, avoiding entanglements with the rumored outcasts or rogues who roamed it. Without any warning, the ground gave a jarring tremor. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from cursing, her entire frame shuddering from the shock. Fearing an earthquake, she crouched, feeling the grit of hot dust scraping her palms. Instinct told her something else might be at play. She pressed her ear to the ground, and her heart pounded against her ribs when she heard a low rumble, almost like mechanical lungs churning beneath the surface. Immediately, she leapt to her feet, scanning the horizon for movement. The dunes and rocky outcroppings shimmered under the scorching sun, but to her right, she glimpsed the slightest shift in the ground. The quake receded. The air was still once more, but her pulse raged, sending adrenaline pounding through her veins. Then she saw the figure. It was too far to make out any details, only that it moved with fluid purpose across the rocky plain. The flicker of unfamiliar color, the suggestion of lavender or violet, caught her eye. She couldn't tell if the figure had noticed her. She doubted it was human. Something about the lithe silhouette, the shape of the limbs, seemed otherworldly. She sucked in a breath, torn between approaching or hiding. Her usually confident stance was shaken by the stories she'd heard of the Barrens. Rumors told of exiled alien warriors who roamed these wastes, cast off from their clans. They were said to be fiercely territorial, wary of intruders. But it would be more dangerous to stand in the open, motionless, than to find a place to gain cover or get a better vantage. She caught sight of a rocky ledge, reminiscent of cracked basalt, only it had a faint sheen like insect wings in sunlight. She made her way there, quietly stepping over the dusty stones, cursing under her breath when they crunched louder than she wanted. The figure halted. She caught the faint movement of what looked like an ear, or perhaps a ridged crest. It turned, scanning in her direction. A breeze stirred, carrying a dryness that scraped her throat as she swallowed. The tension in her chest mounted as she realized she might have been spotted. The figure was definitely not human. Up close, the silhouette seemed to have tall, pointed ears, an elongated neck, and a posture that radiated both caution and quiet strength. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but her curiosity was piqued, and her sense of caution warred with a strange fluttering of interest in her chest. She told herself it might be best to let the alien go, but as she stepped behind the ledge, another tremor rolled through the ground. This one was stronger, and the entire landscape groaned in protest. She lost her balance, slamming shoulder first against the stony outcrop. A hiss of pain slipped from her lips. She nearly dropped her satchel of supplies. Then from her vantage, she saw the earth begin to split about 100 feet away, the rocky crust ripping open like a fresh wound. There came a sharp screeching sound, and a series of mechanical spines rose from the crevasse. Before she could fully process it, the figure in the distance, who had also stumbled, sprang forward gracefully, heading in her direction. She thought maybe the alien was drawn by the same shock, or was seeking safer ground. Torn between self-preservation and worry, She froze, meeting that figure's gaze for the first time when it closed the distance to less than 20 feet. Up close, she noticed the alien was female in shape, athletic yet lithe, with smooth, lavender-tinged skin that gleamed under the fierce sun. Subtle textures across her cheeks and forearms looked like rippled stone or faint mineral striations. She had large almond-shaped eyes that shifted from violet to a shade of cyan as though capturing and reflecting ambient light. A graceful mane of silver-blue hair swept back from her face, hanging in a sleek fall against her back. Riley felt a stir of awe despite her fear. This was no monstrous creature. She looked wary, but there was a certain regal quality in her posture. At that moment, the alien's gaze flicked to the mechanical spines protruding from the now yawning crevasse, and her eyes narrowed. "Stay low," Riley whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure the alien could understand. She motioned with her hand, then flattened herself behind the ledge. A whirring clanking sound emerged from the crevasse, as if gears and pistons turned in unison beneath the cracked ground. When she dared to peek, she spotted metallic constructs, spidery in shape, crawling out of the opening. They were unlike anything she'd seen before, each one with jointed legs, some of which hissed with escaping steam or chemicals. She sensed the air grow heavier, tinged with the acrid smell of molten metal. She exchanged a look with the alien woman, whose expressive eyes glowed more intensely, flickering with what might have been alarm. Riley tried not to panic. She had studied mechanical constructs in her past work when she'd done reconnaissance in remote colonies. She had a knack for analyzing how a machine might move or track. She squinted at the spider-like robots, noticing they were forming a perimeter as though scanning for movement. The ground could quake again, and she didn't have a plan to outrun mechanical creatures if they decided to pursue. Her heart hammered in her chest. The alien next to her breathed softly, her nostrils flaring. Riley noticed how the color of her irises pulsed, and despite everything, she felt an odd comfort in the presence of another soul, even one so different here in the Barrens. The first machine launched forward with a screech that sent dust swirling. Riley and the alien whipped around, flattening themselves further. It skittered about, scanning the area with a rotating sensor. In unspoken agreement, both women decided not to remain idle. The alien gracefully rose into a crouch, her limbs moving with unnerving silence. Riley carefully unclipped a small portable device from her belt, a half-finished invention she'd been tinkering with. It was supposed to jam localized signals if her theories held. She gave the alien a look, then slowly inched around the rock, trying to get close enough to the nearest machine to activate the device without being detected. That was when the alien showed her own skill. She darted ahead in near silence, her tall, pointed ears flicking as if listening to subtle vibrations. She waited for the machine's scanning sweep to pass, then rolled behind another boulder. Riley realized she was good at stealth, likely far better than any human she'd encountered. Summoning her courage, Riley followed suit, timing her movements. As the spider turned away, her heart thudded in her throat. All it would take was one slip, and those mechanical limbs could rip her apart. Another quake rumbled beneath them, and the spider-likes whined, adjusting their stance to remain balanced, fractal eyes scanning the area. Riley exhaled and engaged the jamming device. A faint hum reverberated through her palm, warming her skin. She peeked around the edge of her cover and watched as the nearest machine stumbled, its front legs twitching spasmodically. The alien recognized an opening. With a surprising burst of speed, she launched herself forward, delivering a swift, precise strike to a joint near the machine's upper body. There was a harsh screech of metal on metal, and the spider collapsed onto its side. Sparks flared, leaving a stench of burnt wiring in the air. Riley's stomach churned, but she forced herself not to look away. She was used to improvising, but she'd never fought side by side with a stranger, let alone an alien with such a lethal combination of fluid grace and raw skill. Other constructs noticed the commotion. Two more skittered closer, their spined legs slicing into the cracked ground. Riley tinkered with her device, adjusting the modulation. She had only tested this theory in simulations. She had no guarantees it would hold up in a real battle. She pressed a button and the hum increased in pitch. The second machine jerked its head-like sensor around, momentarily confused. The alien seized the opportunity, but this time the third machine unleashed. A barrage of heated projectiles, the alien dove, rolling to avoid them, and a swirl of dust and hot air rushed over them both. Riley pressed herself flat behind her cover again, sweat trickling down her temple. She heard metal scraping stone as the machines tried to triangulate. The ground threatened to tremble again. Her heart pounded, her gaze darting to the alien, who seemed to be breathing hard, her eyes shifting from violet to bright cyan with each breath. For a split second, their gazes locked. Riley raised the device and gestured. The alien nodded as though she understood the plan. She would distract her, while Riley fine-tuned the jamming frequency. Perhaps with enough amplitude, they could short-circuit the remaining machines. A moment later, the alien vaulted out from behind her boulder, agile and silent, drawing the machine's sensors toward her. Riley stabilized the device on the rock, typed a quick sequence into its small screen, and then let the hum become a high-pitched wail. She felt her own teeth vibrate. Sparks erupted from one of the spiders, then it collapsed in a heap, screeching as it ground to a halt. The third wobbled, then turned its main body back toward Riley, snapping something like a harpoon in her direction. Her heart lurched as she dove aside, the harpoon lodging itself into the stone with a resonant twang. She hadn't expected them to have ranged weapons. The shock nearly made her drop the device, but she fought through the terror, adjusting the dial with trembling fingers. Now the alien came leaping forward. With an elegant twist, she latched onto the top of the final spider, a braced elbow, hooking under what might have been a control node. She slammed her other forearm against a seam in the metal, prying it open with surprising strength. Arcs of electricity crackled, and the spider shuddered. Riley scrambled to maintain the jamming signal, watching in awe as the alien used her body weight to twist the spider's center mass. It caved in with a metallic groan. The spider stumbled, legs flailing, then collapsed. Panting, Riley dropped the device, cutting off the hum. The sudden silence was deafening. She stared across the dust-laden space at the alien, who was breathing, heavily but very much victorious. Cautiously, Riley rose, stepping over the remains. The twisted mechanical limbs sparked feebly. The purple hue of the alien's skin was coated in dust, giving her a smudged, earthy look that contrasted oddly with her otherworldly features. They stood a few steps apart, measuring each other. The alien's eyes flashed from violet to a calmer turquoise, and her gaze lingered on the jamming device in Riley's hand. After a beat of silence, Riley mustered a wry smile. I guess that worked. She tapped her thigh, out of habit, noticing the lack of comprehension in the alien's expression. But the alien's lips pressed together as though she understood the gist. Then softly she spoke. Her voice had a musical undertone with a slight rasp that reminded Riley of wind swirling over a jagged cliff. The words weren't English, but there was a questioning tilt to them. Riley pursed her lips, feeling a sting of regret that she hadn't come prepared with a universal translator. She rummaged in her belt pouch, retrieving a small device about the size of her thumb, a translator module. It was outdated, often glitchy, but might help. She extended it gently, gesturing that she meant no harm. The alien tilted her head, ears perking. Slowly she reached out, her movements cautious yet curious. When her pale, slender fingers brushed Riley's, there was a subtle warmth. Riley felt her breath catch at that simple touch. Maybe it was just a shock of contact. Or maybe it was something more, a quiet recognition that they had just fought together, saved each other from an uncertain fate. That fleeting moment hinted at a hidden compatibility of spirit, not just shared survival. After a few seconds, the device chirped. Riley fiddled with it, pressing a small toggle. She tried speaking again, this time softly. "Can you understand me?" The device produced a garbled echo of her words in the alien's dialect. The alien's brows furrowed. Then, with a short hesitation, she answered in her own language. The translator spat back something in halting English. "Yes, I can understand some." Her voice, fed through the translator, lost some of its musicality but retained a delicate resonance. "My name's Sari'ka." She tapped her sternum, which had a faint swirl of mineral-like patterns. "You are human." Riley nodded. "I'm Riley Harris." She placed her hand on her chest, seeing the alien's eyes flick over her as though absorbing details. "We thank you for helping me back there." She let out a nervous laugh. "Or I guess we saved each other." The translator tried to replicate the phrase, but it glitched midway. Sari'ka seemed to catch the gist. She eyed the mechanical remains warily, as though expecting them to rise up again. After a breath, she turned her attention back to Riley. "Why are you here?" 1,000 answers tripped through Riley's mind, but the simplest one was, "I'm trying to cross the Barrens. I'm alone." The admission sounded heavier out loud. Sari'ka's eyes flicked with that subtle emotional glow, shifting from turquoise to a deeper violet. She nodded as if understanding something about loneliness. Before they could exchange more words, another quake shuddered through the ground, and the crevasse hissed, letting out a plume of heat and foul-smelling fumes. They exchanged a worried look. Neither wanted to remain. Riley motioned that she was heading north. It was the direction that would eventually lead her to rumored tunnels. Caverns she believed might provide a safer passage. Though she half expected the alien to vanish into the shimmering horizon, Sari'ka surprised her by pointing in the same direction. She spoke quickly, the translator lagging, but the gist was, "I must go that way as well. My people are not welcome me. I must find a new path." Her expressive eyes lingered on Riley's face. Riley felt a jab of empathy. She knew how it felt to be unwanted or exiled. Perhaps that was their unspoken bond, two souls drifting without a clan. They picked through the rubble, stepping gingerly over the twisted machines. Some stank of overheated metal, while others twitched feebly. Riley felt a pang of worry, a reminder that the Barrens might be teeming with these mechanical terrors or something even worse. She wondered who had unleashed them. Was it a rogue faction? A malfunctioning defensive system from a forgotten war? She kept her questions silent for now, focusing on the immediate priority of survival. She led the way across a stretch of rocky terrain that radiated warmth, the swirling dust sometimes making her cough. Sari'ka followed, occasionally picking up subtle vibrations with her hand laid gently on the ground as though listening for dangers that Riley couldn't detect. They traveled in near silence for hours, the translator occasionally uttering a phrase or two when necessary. Through that halting exchange, Riley gleaned a bit of Sari'ka's story, cast out from her clan for reasons that still stung. She didn't elaborate, but the bitterness in her gaze was enough to confirm it was a deep betrayal. Riley, in turn, confessed she'd spent her life drifting from one human settlement to another, never truly fitting in. She hinted at a past betrayal of her own. Friends who turned on her when a valuable contract came into question. She had sworn then that she would never again let herself rely on others too completely. Night fell in the Barrens with surprising swiftness. The searing heat gave way to a bone-deep chill, the ground releasing ghosts of vapor that curled around their ankles. They found a shallow alcove beneath a stone ridge, enough to block the wind but not deep enough to be an ideal shelter. Still, it was better than wandering under the star-pocked sky, where mechanical drones, or worse, might prowl. They quietly set up camp, each mindful of the other's personal space. When Riley spread out her thin thermal blanket, she noticed the hesitation in Sari'ka's stance. The alien lingered at the entrance to the alcove, her posture guarded, as though uncertain of how close she should stay. Riley decided to offer a gesture of trust, rummaging in her pack for a ration bar. "Here," she said, tossing it gently. Sari'ka caught it, studying the packaging. When she realized it was edible, she nodded her thanks. That small moment chipped away at the wall between them. Still, as they settled in for the night, the tension was palpable. Riley noticed the subtle flicker in Sari'ka's irises, like pulses of color dancing in time with her heartbeat. She wondered if the alien found it odd to share such a close space with a human. For her part, she tried to steel herself, to remain calm, telling herself it was purely out of necessity. Yet a soft voice in her mind reminded her she hadn't been this close, physically or emotionally, to someone in a long time. After a while she dozed, lulled by exhaustion and the faint crackle of energy in the air. She awoke abruptly some time later to a soft voice near her ear, a gentle question that the translator half captured in broken English. "Human, what was poking me while we slept?" Sari'ka's tone carried a mixture of amusement and caution, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Riley jolted, realizing that in her sleep, her elbow or some part of her gear might have jabbed the alien's side. The question, rendered in that halting mechanical voice from the translator, sounded far more suggestive than intended. A blush flared on Riley's cheeks. She murmured an apology, explaining about the gear strapped to her belt, certain the alien could see her embarrassment by the moonlight that slipped into the alcove. Sari'ka's lips curved in a slight smile, not mocking, but gentle, as though the strangeness of the question also charmed her. She eased closer, settling back into the shared blanket's edge, and for a moment the tension in the alcove softened. Riley noted the faint swirl of color in Sari'ka's eyes, a subdued pink that might have been curiosity or comfort. They were sharing warmth and quiet, forging a tentative bond beyond mere survival. Riley tapped her fingers lightly on her thigh, fighting the swirl of complicated feelings in her chest. She sensed that if she let herself open up, she might get hurt. Again. But deep within, she felt something stir, a hint of hope or desire she couldn't say for sure. She drifted off again, lulled by the gentle presence next to her. When dawn broke, they rose, the morning air crisp. Sari'ka made a quick survey of the terrain just beyond their alcove. Riley carefully inspected her jamming device, recalibrating it for potential use. They resumed their trek, weaving between pillars of stone that glistened as though wet, though the air was so dry it stung their nostrils. As they traveled, the environment grew more bizarre. Some rocks looked like hammered metal, reflecting faint pinkish tones under the pale sky. Rivulets of dust drifted in the wind, and occasionally they spotted strange, insect-like creatures scuttling away at their approach. They spoke more through the translator, haltingly but earnestly. Riley asked about Sari'ka's clan, curious how they could cast out someone who seemed so skilled and decent. Sari'ka hesitated, her jaw tightening, but she eventually admitted her people had strict social hierarchies. She had been blamed for a grave mistake that wasn't entirely hers, but her voice shook with shame as she told the story. She had been the scout in a crucial mission that failed, leading to losses for her clan. They accused her of negligence or even betrayal, and though she swore her innocence, she was exiled. Riley felt a pang of empathy that bordered on heartbreak. She recognized that same lonely weariness. She confessed a bit of her own regrets, how she had once worked with a group that specialized in negotiations between frontier settlements, believing that bridging communities was the key to a better future. But things soured when profits overshadowed morals, and she was scapegoated for calling attention to corruption. That was her final push to leave. She had drifted ever since, never quite trusting others, never letting herself get too close. Sari'ka listened intently, her eyes flicking in color with each new confession, as though absorbing Riley's every emotional nuance. It comforted Riley in a way she hadn't expected. They trudged on, and the day stretched into an endless shimmer of dust and haze. Around midday, they encountered another quake, not as strong as before, but enough to keep them on edge. The ground occasionally shook, belching up hot steam from hidden vents. They navigated cautiously until they reached a region of towering spires that resembled petrified trees, their surfaces rippling like polished stone. Sari'ka bent to touch the base of one, her fingertips tracing faint veins that glowed with a gentle warmth beneath the surface, reminiscent of molten ore. Riley crouched beside her, feeling the hum of energy from the spire. It felt alive in a subtle, disquieting way. Their translator squawked to life as Sari'ka murmured something. "These spires, like my home, but broken." Her tone was thick, with emotion. Riley wondered if Sari'ka recognized some geological link to her homeland. She placed a comforting hand on the alien's shoulder. Sari'ka's breath caught, the swirl of color in her eyes turning a deep, resonant violet. For a moment they stood there, both of them feeling the raw ache of longing for a place that might never truly be theirs again. Soon after, a distant hum vibrated through the air, snapping them to attention. The memory of those mechanical spiders flashed in their minds. They exchanged a look, prepared for another encounter. This time, it was a swarm of smaller drones, each shaped like a bulbous shell with insect-like wings that flitted with a harsh metallic buzz. The swarm crested over a ridge, scanning the area in a searching pattern. Riley and Sari'ka sprinted for cover. They found a hollow behind one of the petrified spires, pressing themselves against the rippling surface. The drones drifted overhead, their sensors casting flickers of red light across the ground. Sari'ka pointed to her ears, indicating she could sense their frequency or scanning pulses. She closed her eyes, focusing, while Riley rummaged for the jamming device. But the swarm was too vast. A single device might not be enough. Sari'ka placed a hand on the spire's surface, and Riley felt an almost imperceptible tremor in the stone. Then something strange happened. The spire emitted a low thrumming, a resonance that rippled outward. The swarm overhead faltered, their scanning beams flickering. Sari'ka's eyes flew open, a triumphant glint bright in their depths. Riley, catching on, activated her device to amplify or complement the resonance. The combined vibrations caused the drones to swirl in disarray, colliding with one another in a metallic cacophony. A few crashed to the ground, sputtering. Others veered off, taking flight away from the spires. The air hummed for several seconds, and then all was still. Riley exhaled in relief, adrenaline coursing through her. She and Sari'ka locked eyes, a flush of excitement passing between them. They had done it again, together, blending Sari'ka's uncanny synergy with the environment and Riley's mechanical savvy. They continued moving through the spires, noticing how the environment subtly changed around them. The petrified surfaces seemed to respond to Sari'ka, sometimes lighting with faint pulses when she brushed her fingers across them. Riley found herself fascinated, her curiosity pushing past her usual caution. "How do you do that?" she asked gently, letting the translator pick up her words. Sari'ka looked self-conscious, but she answered in her soft voice. "My clan taught me to feel what the earth says. Just listen." Riley tapped her thigh, thinking about how that skill combined so well with her own strategic approach. She began to see how they were an unlikely but effective team, two outcasts using their distinct abilities. She felt a subtle warmth towards Sari'ka, something more than gratitude or relief. She tried to quell it, reminding herself that emotional entanglements were risky, but she couldn't deny the way her heart quickened whenever the alien offered a rare, gentle smile. They reached a cavern opening at twilight. The interior glimmered with what looked like dusty crystals embedded in the walls, catching the last of the sunlight in ember-like flickers. By unspoken agreement, they decided to rest there. The day's ordeals had left them drained, and the cavern at least offered some protection from drones or quakes. Inside, the air was cool, faintly moist. Riley let out a sigh of appreciation, stretching her sore limbs. Sari'ka ran her hand along the crystalline walls, eyes flicking with fascinated color. They built a small makeshift camp, rummaging for rations. The translator was quiet for a while, letting them relax in companionable silence. Eventually, as they shared a meal, Sari'ka broke the hush. She gestured toward the shimmering crystals overhead. "Pretty," she said in her accent, before the translator offered. "Reminds me, childhood place. We had caves lit by hidden stones." There was a tremor of loss in her voice, and Riley reached out, gently brushing Sari'ka's forearm. The alien looked up, startled at the tenderness of the gesture, her eyes swirling with an uncertain hue. Riley's own voice felt thick with empathy. "I'm sorry you lost that home." Their gazes locked, and for the first time they truly let themselves see each other. Two exiles, forging a fragile bond in a brutal place. Something in that moment made Riley's pulse thrum. She recalled her vow to never fully trust again. But faced with the open vulnerability in Sari'ka's eyes, she found her walls cracking. She shifted closer, letting their shoulders touch. She felt the warmth of the alien's body, a comforting heat in the cavern's chill. Sari'ka inhaled softly, leaning into that contact with a shy acceptance. Time seemed to slow, the crystal lights overhead painting dancing reflections on their faces. Sari'ka's lips parted as though she had something to say, but the words didn't come. Instead, they sat there, close enough to share breath, hearts pounding in unison. Riley realized she wanted to bridge the distance, to press her lips against Sari'ka's. It was a startling desire, especially given how cautious she'd been, but the raw truth of it was undeniable. Her gaze flicked to Sari'ka's mouth, and she felt her own breathing hitch. Just then, a distant rumble emanated from deeper in the cave. They both tensed, pulling apart slightly, hearts still pounding. Riley rose, flicking on a dim handlight, scanning the darkness. Sari'ka crouched, listening, her ears twitching. For a few seconds, the rumble continued, then faded to silence. They exchanged uneasy looks. Maybe it was just a tremor from the shifting ground or something else lurking in these caverns. Neither wanted to investigate it tonight. They needed rest. They bedded down, side by side. The tension between them crackled with unsaid words. The translator lay inactive in the corner, but they no longer needed to speak. Riley felt a tightness in her chest, part yearning and part fear. She wanted to be close, to share a warmth that went beyond survival. But old ghosts warned her not to trust, not to love. She curled onto her side, letting out a shaky sigh. Sari'ka remained awake a moment longer, eyes flickering with subtle color changes, as if wrestling with her own fears. Then she too lay down, her shoulder brushing Riley's. The gesture was tentative, an unspoken promise. I won't leave you to face this alone. And in that silent vow, they found uneasy sleep. Morning came, and with it, a new challenge. As they ventured deeper into the cavern, they discovered a subterranean passage that might lead them to the other side of the Barrens. The winding tunnels glowed with faint veins beneath the rock, reminiscent of molten ore tracing lines through the stone. The air was damp and smelled of minerals. They had to move carefully, stepping around stalagmites that dripped with condensation. Occasionally, they heard a rumble echo overhead. It felt like the entire region was unstable. The further they went, the more they realized the danger of a cave-in. Still, they pressed on, motivated by the faint hope that these passages would offer a safer path. They encountered labyrinthine sections, each littered with obstacles, fallen rocks, hidden fissures, and ominous pools of scalding water. Several times, they had to double back, searching for alternative routes. At one point, Sari'ka halted abruptly, her eyes narrowing. She pressed a hand to the wall, whispering in her language. The translator weakly offered, "Something is moving. Not rock. Some presence." Riley stiffened, scanning the darkness. She gripped her jamming device, though it might not help if the threat was organic rather than mechanical. She dreaded the possibility of a subterranean creature, but as they advanced they realized it wasn't an animal. Low voices echoed in the cavern, and soon they spotted figures. Shadows flitted across a corridor illuminated by crystals. At least 3 individuals, possibly more, armed with rifles or energy weapons. They wore mismatched gear, ragtag helmets, some brandishing the insignia of half-forgotten human mercenary outfits. The group seemed to be investigating the crystals, hacking chunks out of the walls with heavy tools. Riley and Sari'ka exchanged a look, creeping closer to observe from behind a stalagmite. They could hear the men talking, their voices echoing, something about a rich haul and selling these alien crystals for a fortune. Another voice complained about the quakes, cursing how the ground threatened to bury them alive. Riley felt a chill. She recognized the type, opportunistic scavengers who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their find. She also realized that if they were carving up the cave structure, they might be destabilizing the entire network of tunnels. That could explain the rumbling. A flicker of anger rose within her. She had no love for those who exploited or destroyed, but there were more immediate dangers. One of the men, a tall, broad figure with a shaved head, swung around and spotted movement. He raised his rifle, scanning the darkness. Riley and Sari'ka froze. The group advanced, the one in the front calling out, "Who's there?" His voice was laced with threat. Another man leveled his weapon. Riley knew they had to move or risk getting cornered. She mouthed a plan to Sari'ka: retreat further into the darkness, circle around, and avoid confrontation if possible. They just wanted to pass through. They had no interest in the crystal's value, but fate had other plans. An unexpected tremor jolted the cavern. Cracks raced along the walls, and chunks of crystal and rock collapsed from the ceiling. The scavengers shouted in alarm, scattering. One fired a shot reflexively into the darkness, the energy bolt sizzling past Sari'ka's ear. Instinct took over. Sari'ka darted forward, tackling Riley out of harm's way behind a rocky outcrop. The translator clattered across the floor. Dust exploded around them, stinging their eyes. The ceiling above the scavengers gave way in a thunderous crash, sealing the corridor behind a mass of rubble. Coughing, Riley scrambled to find the translator. The dust choked her lungs, and she felt Sari'ka gripping her arm, guiding her to a less unstable section of the tunnel. They could hear the scavengers yelling behind the newly formed wall of debris trapped on the other side. Riley tensed, uncertain if she should feel relief or pity. Maybe they'd get out on their own. Their presence here was destructive, but it seemed cruel to leave them entombed. Yet to help them risked unleashing more collapse. Sari'ka's eyes darted back and forth. She too was torn. Through halting gestures and the few words they'd memorized, they communicated their dilemma. The translator lay half buried in rubble, flickering with broken lights. Riley tried to scoop it up, but it hissed with static. She could catch a few words as Sari'ka pointed at the debris. They cause danger. We cannot leave like this. Riley realized Sari'ka felt a moral pull to try and help them, even if they were destructive. A pang of admiration mixed with concern surged within her. She didn't want to see Sari'ka risk her life for strangers who might turn a gun on them the moment they were free. They decided to at least check if there was a safer way to remove some of the rubble. As they approached, they heard the scavengers cursing, some in pain. The roof threatened another collapse, so they worked cautiously, dislodging smaller stones. The men on the other side sensed their help, piling away debris from their side. After a tense hour of clearing, they managed to open a gap. One of the scavengers, a wiry man with a scarred cheek, peered through. "Hey, you... thanks," he said uncertainly when he realized he was looking at a human woman and an alien. Then his expression hardened. "We want out. You want crystals? We'll share. Just let us through." Riley shook her head, trying to convey they only wanted safe passage. She felt Sari'ka tense at her side. The translator flickered, picking up the man's words but struggling to produce a response. Another quake rattled the area and a chunk of ceiling nearly crushed them. That put the conversation on hold as they scrambled to brace themselves. The men forced their way through the gap once it was large enough, covered in dust and battered. Their rifles remained slung over their shoulders, tension thick in the air. The broad-shouldered leader locked eyes with Riley. "Who are you?" he demanded gruffly, voice echoing in the tight space. She gave her name only. He introduced himself as Ferric, a claim jumper from an outlying human settlement. He sized up Sari'ka, lips curling with suspicion. "We heard about your kind in these parts. They say your people have weird powers." The hostility in his voice made Riley's blood chill. She wanted to snap back, but recognized the precariousness of the situation. Ferric jerked his thumb at the debris-strewn corridor. "We'll help each other out for now, but once we're clear, we go our separate ways. And if your alien friend tries anything, well..." He patted his rifle. The threat was clear. Sari'ka's eyes flared with a fierce shift in color, but she said nothing. Riley placed a restraining hand on her arm, giving her a subtle shake of the head. They needed to pick their battles carefully. They navigated deeper through the twisting tunnels, hoping to find an exit or at least a stable pathway. Ferric's group greedily chipped crystals whenever they could, ignoring the tremors their actions caused. Riley pleaded with them to stop, at least until they were out of danger, explaining the risk. They mostly ignored her, though one or two seemed uncertain, looking at the quaking walls with growing fear. Tension between them mounted. Sari'ka stayed silent, her posture rigid, waiting for a moment to break away. The final straw came when a quake of greater intensity shook the cavern, sending razor-sharp stalactites crashing down. One of Ferric's men was impaled, his dying scream echoing through the gloom. Panic tore through the scavengers. They turned on Sari'ka, suspecting her presence was cursing them or somehow causing the quakes. Ferric snarled, brandishing his rifle in her face. "Stop whatever witchcraft you're doing." Riley stepped in front of Sari'ka, anger blazing in her eyes. She snapped. "She's not causing this. You're the ones destabilizing the tunnels with your mining." Ferric spat on the ground, fear contorting his features. Another quake loomed, the ceiling cracking ominously. In the chaos, one of the scavengers fired a shot at Sari'ka. She dodged, the bolt scorching a portion of the wall. A chunk of rock collapsed, pinning two others. Riley clenched her fists, heart pounding. She realized they had to get out. Ferric was beyond reason, delirious with fear and greed. With no time to weigh moral dilemmas, Riley grabbed Sari'ka's hand and they bolted down a side passage, ignoring the shouts behind them. They nearly slipped on wet stone, their hearts hammering as the ground continued to shake. Once certain they weren't followed, they paused to catch their breath. Dust coated their hair and clothing, and their lungs burned. Sari'ka clung too, Riley's hand, her skin trembling. They navigated blindly until they spotted a faint glow up ahead. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling arching overhead like a cathedral. Veins of shimmering rock traced every surface, pulsating with warm light. At the center, an underground water source gently steamed, its surface reflecting that same serene glow. It was breathtaking and possibly dangerous if another quake hit, but they had nowhere else to go. They sank to their knees at the water's edge, exhausted. Riley cradled Sari'ka's face, searching for any injuries. She noticed a shallow cut above the alien's brow, trickling blood that was a darker purple than human blood. She gently brushed away the droplets with a piece of cloth. Sari'ka's eyes softened, her breath ragged. They needed comfort, solace. The translator flickered nearby, but they didn't reach for it. Words felt unnecessary right now. Riley leaned in, letting her forehead touch Sari'ka's in a gesture of quiet intimacy. Her fingers trembled as they traced the alien's cheek. The water's soft radiance danced across Sari'ka's lavender skin, highlighting every ripple in that mineral-like texture. A shudder went through her as she let out a breath she'd been holding. Slowly, she placed a hand at the nape of Riley's neck, guiding her closer. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, born of desperate need and a fragile trust that had been building. The first brush of contact was gentle, exploratory. A flood of warmth radiated through Riley's body, momentarily blotting out the memory of fear and violence. Sari'ka's lips parted, her breath mingling with Riley's, and they clung to each other, letting the crystal-lit chamber become their world for that moment. Riley felt her heart pounding in her ears, her fingers tangling in Sari'ka's silver-blue hair. The kiss deepened, each shift of their bodies speaking of relief, gratitude, and an undercurrent of desire that had been growing since the first moment they'd fought side by side. When they broke apart, eyes fluttering open, they shared a look of wonder and a trace of uncertainty. They were two different species from two different worlds, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But right now, in this hidden chamber, they found a measure of peace. Sari'ka exhaled shakily, a slight curve tugging at her lips. Riley smiled back, letting out a nervous laugh. The moment felt fleeting, yet monumental. Sari'ka's hand slid to the back of Riley's shoulder, urging her down to the soft ground near the water. There was a question in her eyes, mirrored in Riley's. They had risked their lives together. They had saved each other more than once. Perhaps it was time to take solace in one another's arms. Riley leaned in again, letting her lips roam across Sari'ka's jaw, tasting the salt of dust and sweat. Their breath hitched in unison, bodies pressing closer. Tension of a different kind now thrummed between them, urgency and need, but also a tenderness that came from respect and mutual care. Hands wandered with curiosity. Riley traced the subtle ridges in Sari'ka's arms, marveling at the textures. Sari'ka responded by brushing gentle caresses along Riley's waist, an unspoken invitation to shed the weight of their gear, their burdens. The fear of cave-ins and the threat of mercenaries receded, replaced by a profound longing to connect. They kissed again, more hungrily this time, tongues meeting with an electric heat that sent tremors through them both. Their heartbeats pounded like a shared drum, while the glow from the chamber's walls seemed to brighten, as if the environment responded to their heightened emotions. Riley's senses whirled. She noted every detail: the cool stone beneath, Her knees, the trickle of distant water, the slight quiver in Sari'ka's breath. When they finally pulled back for air, both were trembling, their eyes locked, brimming with feelings they hadn't dared to articulate. With a wordless nod, they leaned in once more, letting passion guide them into a deeper intimacy. They explored each other's bodies in slow, tender motions, clothes and armor parted, revealing warm skin against lavender flesh. They took their time, learning each other's contours, comforting old scars with reverent touches. When the moment became too intense for words, they slipped into a breathless hush, pressing their bodies together in an embrace that felt as necessary as breathing. The tension built, urging them toward a consuming union. The flickering crystals cast dancing lights across intertwined limbs. Sari'ka's alien biology revealed subtle differences, but the universal language of desire bridged any gaps. Riley lost herself in sensation, surrendering to an instinctive rhythm that pulsed between them. She felt Sari'ka shiver beneath her palms, and she marveled at how right it felt to hold and be held. As the shared heat of their passion grew, they inched closer to the water's edge, steam curling around them like an ethereal veil. Soft gasps and murmurs echoed in the spacious chamber. Their eyes slid shut as the final barrier of caution slipped away, replaced by trust. They fell into each other with an abandon that only two souls adrift could know. Eventually, when the urge became overwhelming, they faded into that union, hearts pounding in unison, bodies alive with each other's warmth. Then the world went silent, but for their mingled breaths, time losing meaning in that tender clash of skin and soul. A hush settled, a sense of weightlessness. In that moment, they both forgot the Barrens, the quakes, the threats, lost in a reverie of shared vulnerability. Eventually, a wave of fulfillment washed over them. They collapsed into each other, hearts thudding. Sari'ka pressed her forehead against Riley's collarbone, her breath still ragged. Riley stroked her hair, feeling tears threaten. She had never felt so exposed or so free. For a while they just lay there, entwined, letting the calm seep into their bones. The glow of the chamber seemed to dim slightly, as though respecting their moment of recovery. When they stirred, they exchanged shaky smiles. Sari'ka's eyes were tinted a soft hue that Riley interpreted as contentment. They dressed in silence, reaffixing gear and checking for any injuries. Neither spoke, yet both felt the magnitude of what had transpired. Their bond was no longer tentative. It was forged through shared danger and a profound act of trust. Words would come later, once they'd processed this shift in their relationship, but a lingering look they shared spoke volumes. We're in this together now. Reality came crashing back when another tremor rippled through the chamber. A trickle of debris fell, prompting them to hastily gather their belongings. They found a narrow passage that seemed to ascend. Perhaps it led to the surface. They helped each other climb, stepping on rock ledges damp from condensation. Their arms and legs ached, but they pressed on, determined. At last, they glimpsed a shaft of light filtering through a rift overhead. They maneuvered through the final choke point, gasping as they emerged onto a ledge high above the Barrens. The view took their breath away. Far below, the dunes and rocky formations stretched out in a patchwork of rust-colored earth and shimmering outcrops. The sky overhead was tinged with the pink and orange of late afternoon. The Barrens, in all its harsh glory, lay before them, and for the first time it felt almost beautiful. Sari'ka inhaled deeply, turning her face to the breeze. Riley watched her, heart swelling at the sight of her silhouette against the sun's warmth. They exchanged a look. No words were needed to acknowledge they'd left something of themselves in that underground chamber, fears, doubts, and old pains. Now they faced a new challenge, crossing the remaining expanse of the Barrens. They decided to scout a route from this elevated vantage. Sari'ka pointed to the far horizon, where the land seemed to rise into gentler hills. Through the translator, they pieced together a plan. If they could reach those hills, they might follow a natural path to the nearest known settlement. Riley felt her heartbeat quicken at the thought of returning to any settlement, let alone with an alien by her side. She worried about how humans might react to Sari'ka, but seeing the resolve in Sari'ka's eyes, Riley swallowed her fear. She vowed she wouldn't abandon Sari'ka no matter the cost. They descended from the ledge, careful on the rocky slope. Partway down, they heard a distant roar in the sky. They froze, scanning above. A massive aircraft soared overhead, likely a cargo hauler or a militarized vessel. It circled, the roar of its engines echoing across the Barrens. Riley felt a knot tighten in her stomach, remembering the mechanical constructs they had fought. Could this ship be their source? She exchanged a concerned glance with Sari'ka. The alien nodded, grim understanding in her eyes. They found a depression in the rock, pressing themselves against it as the craft passed overhead. They watched it land in the distance, stirring up a storm of dust. Figures disembarked, too far to identify, but the glint of metallic shapes told them these might be more of those spider-like machines or something equally menacing. This was no mere salvage operation. Some powerful entity was orchestrating these mechanical forces, possibly to control the region's resources or to mine something. Fear churned in Riley's gut. If they wanted to get out of the Barrens safely, they might have to confront whoever was behind this. The scale of the operation suggested that the intruders wouldn't let travelers pass unmolested. She and Sari'ka considered their next move. They could attempt to skirt around the area, taking a long detour, but the Barrens were unpredictable, and detours meant more risk of encountering quakes or running out of supplies. Alternatively, they could try to sabotage the operation, or at least disable enough of those mechanical guardians to slip by. As they debated in hushed voices, Sari'ka's gaze hardened, a flicker of color crossing her eyes. "If they remain," she said through the translator's sputtering static, "they will destroy more land, like my clan once suffered." Riley heard the unspoken plea. Sari'ka wanted to do something more than just run. It was in that moment that Riley recognized how much Sari'ka had changed her. Before, she would have chosen the path of least resistance, trusting no one, simply trying to survive. Now, she felt a responsibility, a call to stand up for something beyond herself. The outcast alien by her side deserved a world where she could find acceptance without fear, and Riley felt compelled to help create that chance. With a determined nod, she agreed. They would face the threat, but they would do so carefully, pooling their unique strengths. They spent the rest of that evening scouting vantage points. They discovered a ridge overlooking the makeshift encampment around the landed ship. Through battered binoculars, Riley counted at least a dozen armed personnel, some human, some possibly augmented with cybernetics. Rows of mechanical spiders stood in neat formation, occasionally powered up by technicians who tinkered with their metal limbs. Thick cables snaked into the rocky ground, leading into portable drilling rigs. Sari'ka recognized the faint hum of these machines coring into the Barrens, searching for something. A bitter memory flashed across her features, and she explained. "They did similar where I lived. It brought destruction." Riley felt her anger simmer. She recalled how planet after planet had been ravaged by unregulated exploitation. She quietly formulated a plan. They could cause a chain reaction in the machine's power supply, forcing the operation to halt. Maybe they wouldn't defeat the entire force, but if they crippled the central rig, it would disrupt the network. That might give them enough time to cross safely. Sari'ka agreed, adding that her ability to sense subtle tremors and energy flows could help them identify structural weak points in the drilling rig. With each new idea, they felt their synergy grow, a testament to how their bond had deepened. Late into the night, they crept down from the ridge, avoiding patrolling guards. Sari'ka led the way, moving with silent precision, her ears twitching to gauge the faintest sounds. Riley followed, fiddling with the jamming device, now modified for a more powerful burst that might overload the rig's circuitry. The plan was straightforward, yet dangerous. Infiltrate the perimeter, plant the device near the rig, trigger a catastrophic overload, then slip away in the chaos. They hoped to avoid direct confrontation. If forced to fight, they'd rely on Sari'ka's agility and Riley's strategic timing. They reached the edge of the camp, hiding behind metal crates. A tension crackled in the air, the mechanical spider's eyes glowing faintly. One guard passed within a few feet, oblivious to them. The hum of the drilling rig was louder here, a constant vibration that rattled their teeth. Sari'ka closed her eyes, placing a hand on the ground. She frowned, then motioned for Riley to follow. They snuck around the far side of the rig, where the cables ran into a generator unit. Thick, pulsing wires fed power to both the rig and the spider-likes. If they severed or sabotaged this connection at the right moment, it might cause a chain reaction. Riley knelt by the generator's control panel, connecting her device carefully. The translator beeped in her pocket, momentarily drawing a guard's attention. Sari'ka swiftly pressed herself against the crate, holding her breath. The guard moved on. Riley exhaled, focusing on splicing wires. She needed to calibrate the jamming frequency precisely to match the rig's power cycle. The process took agonizing minutes, each second feeling like an hour. Her heart hammered as she recalled the times she'd done field modifications under pressure. This was more delicate. A single miscalculation and they might just blow themselves up. Finally, she signaled success with a small nod to Sari'ka. The alien hovered nearby, eyes bright with readiness. Carefully, Riley activated the device, setting a delayed trigger for a massive feedback surge. She gave them 2 minutes to clear out. They inched away, hearts pounding, trying not to attract attention. But fate intervened again. A patrolling guard spotted Sari'ka's silhouette. With a shout, he raised his weapon. Another guard joined him, yelling at them to halt. Riley grabbed Sari'ka's hand, and they broke into a sprint. Alarms blared across the camp. Gunfire erupted, streaking the night. Mechanical spiders activated, their joints screeching. Riley and Sari'ka wove between crates, adrenaline surging. They dove behind a stack of metal sheets just as bullets pinged off the steel. Sari'ka waited for a lull and then darted forward, her lithe body a blur in the flashing lights. She incapacitated one guard with a swift strike to the temple. Riley tossed a small improvised explosive at a cluster of spiders, forcing them to scatter. Then the rig's siren changed pitch, indicating a power fluctuation. The sabotage was nearing its moment of detonation. They had seconds to escape. They sprinted. For the perimeter, guards in pursuit. Just as they cleared the edge of the camp, a deafening crack rang out. The generator erupted in a spray of sparks. Arcs of electricity whipped through the cables, dancing to the drilling rig. In a terrifying instant, the rig's core went critical. Explosions ripped through it in a chain reaction, sending metal debris skyward. The shockwave knocked Riley and Sari'ka off their feet, the ground trembling with the force. Alarms sputtered and died. Darkness, lit only by flames, swallowed the camp. Gunfire ceased as chaos reigned. The mechanical spiders seized up, collapsing. Riley lay stunned for a moment, ears ringing. Sari'ka crawled to her, eyes full of frantic concern. She helped Riley to her feet, supporting her weight. Both coughed from the dust and smoke, but they were alive. Together, they fled into the night, the flickering glow of the burning rig receding behind them. By dawn, they had put miles between themselves and the wreckage. Their arms clung to each other for support, exhaustion threatening to drag them down. But the sense of triumph glimmered in their tired eyes. They had faced a powerful threat and lived. They found a relatively sheltered spot under a rocky outcrop, the morning sun lighting up the horizon. Even battered and covered in grime, they couldn't help but share a weary smile. Sari'ka brushed back Riley's hair and pressed a tender kiss to her temple. Riley let her eyes drift shut, leaning into that touch. Through the translator's occasional sputter, they exchanged words of relief. "We did it," Riley murmured. Sari'ka nodded. Together, worn as they were, they needed rest, but the Barrens wouldn't offer any true safety. They pressed on, determined to reach the hills. Each step was an ordeal, but they took solace in each other. When they finally crested the last ridge, they were greeted by a gentler landscape, a series of rolling slopes dotted with scraggly vegetation. It felt like another world compared to the harsh desolation behind them. A faint ribbon of a road, likely leading to a settlement, appeared in the distance. Relief and apprehension tangled in Riley's chest. She wasn't sure how people would receive an alien outcast, but she was done running from fear. They descended the ridge, hand in hand. As they walked, they spoke about their futures, haltingly. Sari'ka admitted she never expected to see beyond the Barrens. Now she dared to dream of forging a new life. Riley admitted she never expected to trust again, or to find a partner who understood her. Now, she felt she couldn't imagine her life without Sari'ka. Their confessions were soft, overshadowed by the sigh of a gentle breeze over the hills. But in that hush, they solidified the bond that had grown from adversity and intimacy. Evening found them on the outskirts of a modest settlement, a scattering of prefabricated structures that shimmered like hammered steel against the fading light. The settlement had a humble watchtower, a few solar arrays, and signs of farmland, where tough, genetically modified crops clung to the soil. Riley's heart pounded as they approached, unsure of the reception. A guard posted at the entrance eyed them warily, but didn't immediately raise a weapon. Perhaps their battered state, or the exhaustion on their faces, conveyed they meant no harm. A short time later, they found themselves in a small open courtyard, faced with the settlement's unofficial leader, an older woman named Mara. She surveyed them with a keen gaze. "You both look like you've been through the ringer," she remarked. Riley nodded wearily, explaining they had crossed the Barrens and encountered a dangerous operation with mechanical constructs. She didn't hide Sari'ka's origins, though she braced for the worst. Mara's eyes flicked to the alien. "We don't see many of your kind here," she said quietly. Sari'ka stood tall, meeting Mara's gaze but saying nothing. Mara studied her for a moment longer. "We don't have much, but we won't turn away anyone who's not looking for trouble." Relief flooded Riley, and she caught the slight tremble in Sari'ka's stance. They were offered a modest room in a communal bunkhouse. It was cramped, with thin walls and cots lined in a row, but it was a chance to rest. The other occupants gave them wary glances, but no one objected outright. Sari'ka sank onto a cot, exhaling with a relief that bordered on disbelief. Riley joined her, ignoring the curious stares. They let themselves relax for the first time in days, side by side, hands clasped. In low whispers, they spoke of the final quake in the Barrens, the sabotage of the drilling rig, and how they had survived. Even their own blossoming connection felt surreal, a bond forged in harrowing extremes. That night, they slipped outside, to find some privacy beneath the pale moon. The settlement's meager generator lights cast long shadows across the dirt. Riley wrapped her arms around Sari'ka's waist, resting her chin on the alien's shoulder. Sari'ka leaned back into her, eyes closed, a serene expression softening her features. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in silence, hearts beating in unison. Eventually, Riley pressed a kiss to Sari'ka's cheek. Sari'ka turned, capturing Riley's mouth in a lingering kiss that tasted of promise rather than desperation. They walked a short distance until they found themselves in a quiet corner near the settlement's perimeter. There, under a patch of star-studded sky, they once again let their desire claim them. The fear that had governed them for so long ebbed away, replaced by a deliberate, tender connection. They sank into each other's embrace, the hush of the night framing their soft gasps and whispered reassurances. Each caress spoke of gratitude, each kiss an affirmation that they had defied the odds. They took their time, exploring each other's bodies anew, the hum of distant generators blending with the pounding of their own pulses. When at last the intensity peaked, they let the moment carry them into a private darkness, hearts aflame. The world seemed to hold its breath, and when they emerged, breathless and clinging to each other, they knew their bond had been irrevocably sealed. In the following days, they helped the settlement with odd jobs. Riley employed her strategics mind to repair a broken water purification system, while Sari'ka used her sensitivity to detect underground water channels and locate a more stable foundation for expansion. Though some settlers remained suspicious, a few warmed to them, especially after seeing how their skills benefited the community. A sense of quiet pride blossomed in Riley's chest. She realized she was doing something meaningful, and for once, she wasn't alone. Sari'ka, too, seemed to lighten, the hues in her eyes often reflecting calm blues and soft violets rather than the flickers of fear or anger. One evening, Mara approached them. "Word is that the Barrens might have been cleared of that dangerous lot," she said. "We've heard rumors of explosions and a crippled operation. Seems we have you two to thank." Riley and Sari'ka exchanged looks. "We only did what we had to," Riley responded. Mara nodded, her gaze resting on Sari'ka. "If you two want to stay, we wouldn't turn you away. We could use people like you, people who get things done and protect what's worth protecting." For a long moment, no one spoke. Riley looked at Sari'ka, seeing the ghost of longing in her expression. Sari'ka gently touched the back of Riley's hand, remembering how she had been cast out by her own clan. Now, perhaps, there was a chance to start anew, not with her old people, but with humans who might eventually accept her. They found themselves in the bunkhouse later, quietly discussing Mara's offer. Sari'ka expressed her uncertainty, her voice trembling with vulnerability. She feared that if her presence caused trouble or made the settlement a target, she'd be blamed again. Riley squeezed her hand, leaning in to rest her forehead against Sari'ka's. "I know the risk," she murmured, "but I also know what it's like to drift with no home." Their eyes locked, and a wave of unspoken understanding passed between them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they faced them together now. Days passed, and they began integrating with the community. Riley helped organize supply runs. Sari'ka trained some of the settlement's scouts in stealth and reading subtle land cues. The transitions weren't always smooth. There were tense glances, whispered judgments. But as the settlement saw the benefits of their contributions, acceptance grew. At night, Riley and Sari'ka found each other's arms again, sometimes in the bunkhouse if it was empty enough, sometimes beneath the open stars, seeking that closeness that felt new and necessary. Their love was quiet, unspoken, yet undeniable. Eventually, another quake rumor reached the settlement, an aftershock from the Barrens that threatened to shift a fault line near the settlement's water source. The community fretted, uncertain if they might face the same disasters that plagued the Barrens. This time, Riley and Sari'ka took charge, leading a small team to reinforce the water channels. While climbing through rocky terrain, Riley found Sari'ka pausing to touch a trembling boulder. Sari'ka's eyes flared with color. "The ground is unstable," she said softly. "We must brace it." Together, they instructed the team on installing supports. Their efforts proved timely. When the quake finally hit, it was milder than feared, and the newly placed supports held. Relief swept over the settlement. Cheers erupted, and for the first time, Sari'ka was greeted with grateful claps on the back, acknowledging her as more than an outsider. Riley watched the scene, heart swelling with pride. This right here was what she'd always yearned for, a sense of belonging and purpose, shared with someone she cared about. That evening, the entire settlement gathered for a modest celebration by torchlight. People sipped homemade drinks and traded stories. Music drifted from a stringed instrument one of the settlers played. Riley and Sari'ka found themselves standing near the flickering flames, the warm glow on their faces. Mara raised a cup in their honor. "To our new defenders, who've made this place safer!" The settlement echoed the toast. Riley felt her cheeks flush with humble satisfaction. Sari'ka turned to her, the swirl in her irises reflecting the fire. They stepped away from the crowd, seeking a quieter spot at the edge of the gathering. Sari'ka's hand slid into Riley's. In a voice that quavered slightly, she said, "We found a home. Didn't expect." Riley's throat tightened. She squeezed Sari'ka's fingers. "I never expected to find you," she whispered. They kissed softly, oblivious to the curious looks from a few onlookers. The night's breeze carried the gentle sound of the crowd's laughter, and for once there was no threat looming, no quake to fear. Time flowed, and in the weeks that followed, their place in the settlement solidified. Together, they oversaw expansions that respected the land's natural rhythms. They shared knowledge of mechanical jamming and empathic land reading, forging a new harmony. Though outsiders occasionally arrived, sometimes with misguided prejudice toward Sari'ka, the settlement, guided by Mara's leadership, stood firm in her defense. Bit by bit, suspicion gave way to acceptance. One morning, Riley woke early in the bunkhouse. She found Sari'ka gazing at her with a serene smile. Outside, the sun was just rising, painting the sky in pink and gold. They dressed quietly and slipped out, taking a walk to the far edge of the farmland. The air smelled of tilled soil and hope. They paused at a spot where newly sprouted plants were being coaxed from the ground, small but tenacious. Sari'ka knelt, gently running her fingers across the damp earth. Riley crouched beside her, Their eyes met in a moment of shared wonder, marveling at how life could thrive even in the harshest conditions. Riley recalled all they had endured, the mechanical monstrosities, the treacherous tunnels, the heartbreak of betrayals past. She reached for Sari'ka's hand, her voice catching. "I was so afraid to trust again," she admitted, "but you taught me to listen." Sari'ka's lips curved gently. She caressed the back of Riley's hand, the swirl of color in her eyes, warming into a gentle blue. "You taught me to have hope," she murmured. The translator in Riley's pocket picked up the phrase but offered only a patchy echo. They didn't need it. They rose to their feet and faced each other. Riley felt her heart pounding, not with fear, but with certainty. "Sari'ka," she whispered, "I want you to know I'm with you, no matter what." Her voice trembled with sincerity. In response, Sari'ka leaned in, pressing their foreheads together. She spoke softly, letting the translator try its best. "Riley, love." That single word reverberated in the morning air, carrying a weight that transcended species or differences. A breeze stirred the sprouting plants. The settlement stirred awake behind them, a testament to the new life they had helped cultivate. As the sun climbed, the dust of the Barrens seemed far away. Together they walked back toward the settlement, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Their story wasn't about escaping the Barrens alone. It was about finding each other in the wasteland, forging a home from broken pieces, and proving that even the harshest, strangest worlds could become a place of love and belonging if two souls dared to trust. They returned to their duties that day, but the warmth of that moment lingered in their minds. Each time they crossed paths, their eyes lit up with that unspoken connection, the knowledge they had chosen this life, and each other, fully. The quakes subsided, the settlement grew, and a quiet peace settled over the region. Rumors trickled in that whoever had funded the drilling operation wouldn't return soon, having suffered catastrophic losses. The Barrens might still be unpredictable, but at least for now, it was free of that threat. Weeks turned into a gentle season of relative prosperity. Riley and Sari'ka stood side by side outside a newly constructed building near the farmland, a symbol of the settlement's steady growth. People bustled around them, carting supplies. Mara strolled over, arms crossed, a grin creasing her weathered face. "You two are about the best thing that's happened to this place in a long while. I owe you my thanks." Sari'ka dipped her head respectfully, while Riley tapped her thigh, a habit she still couldn't shake. "We're just doing our part," she replied. When night fell, they found themselves alone again, this time in a small cabin that the settlement had offered them as a private dwelling. It was modest, a single room with a sturdy door and a thin roof, but it was theirs. They lit a lantern, the soft glow illuminating their tired but content faces. The day's labor had left them sore, yet an undercurrent of excitement thrummed through them. Sari'ka hung her cloak on a peg, turning to watch Riley. Their eyes locked, and the intimacy of that moment was as potent as any they'd shared in the Barrens. Riley stepped forward, sliding her arms around Sari'ka's waist. Their bodies pressed together, the day's dust not yet washed off, but neither cared. Sari'ka tilted her head, letting their lips meet in a slow, deliberate kiss. The hush of the night outside seemed infinite. By unspoken agreement, they moved. Deeper into the cabin, hands exploring with renewed curiosity. Every scar, every mark was a testament to their survival, and each gentle touch was an act of reverence. Clothes were shed, hearts pounded, and their breathing became ragged. They sank onto the simple cot, letting passion guide them. This time it wasn't about desperate relief or fleeting safety. It was about affirming the life they were building together. Skin against lavender skin, they lost themselves in tender exploration. When the lantern's light began to flicker, they let themselves fade into the intimate darkness, a subtle shift that marked how their bodies and souls entwined. They held nothing back, both giving and receiving. Eventually they lay tangled in each other's arms, breath mingling in the warm gloom, a sense of profound fulfillment settling over them like a soft blanket. Afterward, as they drifted in a serene half-sleep, Sari'ka whispered words the translator didn't catch. Riley's heart clenched at their softness, even if she couldn't pass each syllable. She felt the sincerity in the alien's embrace, understood the meaning in the gentle hush of her voice. She pressed a drowsy kiss to Sari'ka's temple, letting the unconditional warmth in her own chest speak volumes. Even in that small cabin, they felt an unassailable sense of home. Weeks blended into months, each one a testament to how much had changed. The once suspicious settlers gradually embraced Sari'ka as a guardian spirit of sorts, reliant on her uncanny ability to read the land's shifts. Riley became a respected figure for her organizational skills and her calm leadership during crises. Together, they shaped the settlement's future, forging trade routes, overseeing expansions, and welcoming other drifters in need of a second chance. When old fears tried to resurface, like the memory of betrayal or exile, they found strength in each other. A look, a touch, a whispered reminder of that moment they first teamed up against the mechanical spiders, or that passionate union in the cavern beneath the Barrens. It was enough to reaffirm the trust they had built. Their relationship became an example for others that differences could be bridged if the will was there. In time, the region around the Barrens stabilized further. Reports indicated that the quake activity had settled to a manageable level. The route became safer for travelers. A new alliance of settlers, spurred by Mara and others, formed to protect and maintain responsible use of the land's resources. Riley and Sari'ka played a key role, traveling occasionally to neighboring outposts to share their story, forging a fragile but hopeful network of cooperation. There were challenges, of course. Not everyone accepted an alien in a position of leadership, but over time, Sari'ka's actions spoke louder than any prejudice. One late afternoon, after returning from a successful negotiation with a distant outpost, Riley and Sari'ka found themselves gazing at a sunset that splashed the sky with vivid oranges and purples. They perched on a small rise overlooking the settlement, the farmland glowing in the twilight. A gentle breeze stirred Sari'ka's silver-blue hair. Riley's hand rested in hers, fingers interlaced. They watched the sun sink, a symbol of another day they had built side by side. A sense of finality and peace settled over them. Their journey from the Barrens to this place of acceptance hadn't been easy, but it felt complete. No longer exiles, no longer alone, they had resolved the conflict that once threatened their safety. They had found a new life where their hearts could heal and thrive. Riley sighed, resting her head against Sari'ka's shoulder. "We made it," she whispered. Sari'ka looked at her, eyes shifting to a warm turquoise. Together, she repeated that same vow they had shared before. They turned back to the horizon, letting the fading sun wash them in its golden light, secure in the knowledge that this was their home, and that their love was as certain as the turning of day into night. The night fell softly, and they lingered, watching stars pierce the sky. No more doubts, no unresolved conflicts. They were changed and shaped by their journey, having broken the walls around their hearts to discover love in the unlikeliest of places. And as the final glow of sunlight receded, they shared a gentle, unhurried kiss, fully certain of the bright future they would face hand in hand.